Uh, yeah, okay. Can everyone hear me? Yeah? Am I heard? Yeah, okay. Hello and welcome to this session, Interpreter of Stories, and of course our writer needs no introduction. Jhumpa Lahiri, one of the most important and fantastic writers of our times. I welcome her to Jaipur and to the Jaipur Literature Festival. Welcome, Jhumpa.
Thank you.
My first question would be, of course, The Lowland, which is a beautiful novel. And would you say that it's set in the most turbulent period of Indian history, which is Naxalite movement and emergency? Would you say that there's been a relative silence around that in writing?
Can everyone hear me? Yes. Thank you all so much for coming. I'm so grateful to be here, to be in Jaipur for this invitation, and really thank you all so much for being here. Yes, The Lowland. Maybe it's easiest for me to explain a little bit the genesis of the book,
Yes.
to explain what inspired me to write about this time period. Is it okay if I leave it like this? It's okay. You can hear me. Okay. So, how to begin? My father grew up in Daliganj, and so when we would come to Calcutta throughout my life, I would stay in his family's home and spend quite a lot of time there. And we came, in fact, in 1972, and then again in 1973, right around the time, right after the sort of height of the violence, the Naxalite violence in Calcutta. But at the time, I was a very young girl. I was 5 years old, so I wasn't. I was vaguely aware of some sort of tension in the air, but I wasn't quite certain what it was. In any case, as I grew older and continued going back to Kolkata and staying in this home, my paternal grandparents' home, at one point I learned about something that had taken place just steps from the home that I knew, that the neighborhood that I stayed in, which was two brothers who had been involved in the Naxalite movement, and one evening during a combing raid, they were killed in front of their family. Their parents and some other members in the household, I think, had been rounded up, and they were killed in front of them. And so I heard about this as a teenager, probably, and it caused a very intense reaction in me, because when I was a young child growing up in America, during the actual movement itself, I was aware of my parents talking about what was going on in the city. Again, they were in America, they weren't here, so they weren't seeing it firsthand, but they would get letters from their family members referring, sometimes almost surreptitiously, to what was going on in the city, because everyone was very nervous. So I was aware of conversations in my own home in America when I was a young girl, of my parents and their friends trying to piece together the details of something that was overtaking their city, and something that was really was making them very nervous, very concerned. And then as an adolescent, I hear about this very specific incident that's taken place in a neighborhood that at that point I've come to know quite well. And so then if you go forward another 15 years, at a certain point, I began to return to this because I was very haunted by the story of the two brothers being killed not only because it's very upsetting just in and of itself, but because I was so familiar with that neighborhood, you know, I could picture it. I mean, I couldn't really, but I could, I don't know, something made it very vivid for me, even though I was raised in a country where I personally was never exposed to any kind of real violence. You know, I would see things on TV or whatever, on the news. I would learn about it, but I wasn't up close to it in any way. So I think over time, you know, both my intuiting that something very scary was happening in Calcutta when I was a small child, and then learning about this killing of these two brothers as an adolescent, and then thinking about it even further on as an adult and at that point as a writer, all sort of culminated in my desire to try to work with these ingredients, and so that was what inspired the writing of the novel. And I think I didn't have any sort of agenda beyond a very personal one at the beginning in terms of writing the book. I remember when I went to Calcutta the last time, 3 years ago, specifically to do a little bit of research for the book. I mean, I already started writing the book, but it wasn't finished, and it was still in a state where something about it wasn't really working for me. And so I talked to some people there, people who knew about the movement, who had been perhaps involved to a certain degree with the movement. I wanted to talk to them. I wanted to hear more from them. And one of the people I spoke with asked me very aptly, why are you writing this book? Why are you writing this book? And it's not good? Sorry.
Is this better? Okay. So he asked me, why are you writing this book? And it was a question that was very basic, but gave me pause, because I really couldn't put it into words, but I said, I just wanted to better understand what happened. And I think that's a very basic reaction. So I didn't really have an objective in terms of, and because I didn't have an objective because I was so ignorant. You know, because I was working out of a place of extreme ignorance as a child, you know, a person who was too young to really have remembered anything that happened anyway. I mean, even if I had been born and raised in Calcutta and had been living in my father's, you know, ancestral home, the day that happened, I still wouldn't really remember it, right? Because I would have been 4 years old. So I was working across all of these barriers, in a sense, but barriers that were very challenging and stimulating for me as a writer, in that I had to imagine my way back into this time period, back into this political reality. I had to imagine my way into all of the characters. I had to create them. I had to work with them to be able to understand them. So all of this is a very long way of saying that I was simply trying to piece this together for myself, and because you know, my sense was, when I would come back to Calcutta throughout my life, because it's a city I've visited throughout my life, that it was something people certainly did still talk about. You know, I mean, I heard about it, and I would hear people talking about it and remembering those years in varying degrees. Depending on who they were, they would have different reactions to what had been happening. But I wouldn't say that there was any sort of silence that I perceived. But on the other hand, you know, something like that happens, and it sort of takes over the life of a city for a period, and then in whatever way it ebbs, and people speak about it less. But because my relationship to the whole thing is so extremely removed, in terms of all of the ways in which I'm limited and kept at arm's length from this story, given my upbringing, given my age and everything, so that for me it was just it was an imaginative journey that I had to make, as well as, obviously working with a historical reality.
Wow. Would you also say that your characters live in two Calcuttas, the real and the imagined?
Do my characters live in two Calcuttas? Well, some of them do. I think in the case of Gauri, the female protagonist in the lowland, I would say she lives in more of an imagined one, because she leaves the country and she doesn't go back for many, many, many years. I think even those who go back with some frequency, my parents, for example, who left India in the 1960s but have continued to come back to India all their lives. Something happens when you leave a place, and when you stop leading your day-to-day life there, it takes on a kind of surreal quality. I can say that now for the first time, that because I have left America and now I live in another country, so when I think about my life in America, I'm seeing it from another perspective, obviously, and so I think that I was very aware of my parents' connection to the India they had left, the India that no longer exists for them. So my father left in 1964, my mother left in 1966, and I think in some sense for them there's an India for them that ceases to exist in that year, because that's the year they cease to exist here as an everyday, ongoing, quotidian reality, and then they begin to live a new life. And then even though they continue to come back, and they come back every 2 years, every year, every 3 years, whatever the pace is, it's still a coming back and not a permanent place for them anymore. So I think as their child, I've grown up very acutely aware of what happens when people leave a place, and how a place that you identify with completely is also a place from which you can have great distance. And so in that sense, I think many of my characters have a similar relationship to these two Kolkatas, and the one they've left and that doesn't exist for them anymore, and then perhaps the one they continue to maintain a relationship with from afar.
Right. Would you like to read a section from your book?
Sure. Are you hearing Rupalini's questions? Yes, you are.
Yeah.
Okay. Because I'm having trouble hearing you for some reason, but as long as you're hearing her, that's fine.
Is this better? I think it's the...
Yeah, that's, if you hold it. I can hear you, but I'm not hearing your mic. Okay.
Yeah.
I'll just read a brief section from toward the beginning of the book. For those of you who haven't read it, I'll just explain. This is a story that begins in the late 1950s in Calcutta, and the beginning begins basically with a portrait of two brothers who grow up very close in age, and this is just a few pages about them. Since childhood, Subhash had been cautious. His mother never had to run after him. He kept her company, watching as she cooked at the coal stove or embroidered saris and blouse pieces commissioned by a lady's tailor in the neighborhood. He helped his father plant the dahlias that he grew in pots in the courtyard. The blooming orbs, violet and orange and pink, were sometimes tipped with white. Their vibrancy was shocking against the drab courtyard walls. He waited for chaotic games to end, for shouts to subside. His favorite moments were when he was alone, or felt alone, lying in bed in the morning, watching sunlight flickering like a restless bird on the wall. He put insects under a domed screen to observe them. at the edges of the ponds in the neighborhood, where his mother sometimes washed dishes if the maid happened not to come, he cupped his hands in turbid water, searching for frogs. He lives in his own world, relatives at large gatherings, unable to solicit a reaction from him, sometimes said. While Subhash stayed in clear view, Udayan was disappearing. Even in their two-room house when he was a boy, he hid compulsively under the bed, behind the doors, in the crate where winter quilts were stored. He played this game without announcing it, spontaneously vanishing, sneaking into the back garden, climbing into a tree, forcing their mother when she called and he did not answer to stop what she was doing. As she looked for him, as she humored him and called his name, Subhash saw the momentary panic in her face that perhaps she would not find him. When they were old enough, when they were permitted to leave the house, they were told not to lose sight of one another. Together they wandered down the winding lanes of their enclave, behind the ponds and across the lowland to the playing field where they sometimes met up with other boys. They went to the mosque at the corner to sit on the cool of its marble steps, sometimes listening to a football game on someone's radio, the guardian of the mosque never minding. Eventually, they were allowed to leave the enclave and to enter the greater city, to walk as far as their legs would carry them, to board trams and buses by themselves. Still, the mosque on the corner, a place of worship for those of a separate faith, oriented their daily comings and goings. At one point, because Udayan suggested it, they began to linger outside Technician's studio, where Satyajit Ray had shot Batir Pachali, where Bengali cinema stars spent their days. Now and then, because someone who knew them was employed on the shoot, they were ushered in amid the tangle of cables and wires, the glaring lights. After the call for silence, after the board was clapped, they watched the director and his crew taking and retaking a single scene, perfecting a handful of lines. A day's work devoted to a moment's entertainment. They caught sight of beautiful actresses as they emerged from their dressing rooms, shielded by sunglasses, stepping into waiting cars. Udayan was the one brave enough to ask them for autographs. He was blind to self-constraints, like an animal incapable of perceiving certain colors. But Subhash strove to minimize his existence as other animals merged with bark or blades of grass. In spite of their differences, one was perpetually confused with the other, so that when either name was called, both were conditioned to answer. And sometimes it was difficult to know who had answered, given that their voices were nearly indistinguishable. Sitting over the chessboard, they were mirror images, one leg bent, the other splayed out, chins propped on their knees. They were similar enough in build to draw from a single pile of clothes. Their complexions, a light coppery compound derived from their parents, were identical. Their double-jointed fingers, the sharp cut of their features, the wavy texture of their hair. Subhash wondered if his placid nature was regarded as a lack of inventiveness, perhaps even a failing in his parents' eyes. His parents did not have to worry about him, and yet they did not favor him. It became his mission to obey them, given that it wasn't possible to surprise or impress them. That was what Udayan did. In the courtyard of their family's house was the most enduring legacy of Udayan's transgressions. A trail of his footprints created the day the dirt surface was paved, a day they'd been instructed to remain indoors until it had set. All morning they'd watched the mason preparing the concrete in a wheelbarrow, spreading and smoothing the wet mixture with his tools. 24 hours, the mason had warned them, before leaving. Subhash had listened, he had watched through the window, he had not gone out. But when their mother's back was turned, Udayan ran down the long wooden plank temporarily set up to get from the door to the street. Halfway across the plank, he lost his balance, the evidence of his path forming impressions of the soles of his feet, tapering like an hourglass at the center, the pads of the toes disconnected. The following day, the mason was called back. By then, the surface had dried and the impressions left by Udayan's feet were permanent. The only way to repair the flaw was to apply another layer. Subhash wondered whether this time his brother had gone too far. But to the mason, their father said, "Leave it be," not for the expense or effort involved, but because he believed it was wrong to erase steps that his son had taken. And so the imperfection became a mark of distinction about their home, something visitors noticed, the first family anecdote that was told.
It's beautiful. The Lowland, of course, is a story of two brothers. Actually, it's so much more. It's so difficult to put it in a sentence. But I would also like to ask you that, would you say that Udayan and Subhash, they are also two portraits of masculinity which you express in your writing?
Are Subhash and Udayan two portraits of, well, it's a portrait of two brothers. That's really all the only way I can describe it. I mean, I think I'm the child of two people who both have only brothers. And I don't have any brothers. I have a sister who is quite a bit younger. But both my mother and my father have and had very intense relationships with their brothers, so my uncles, and all sort of born extremely close, very little gap, So my father had a brother who was just less than 2 years older, and my mother was one of 4 children. She was the only daughter, but she had 3 brothers. So when I would go to Calcutta and see my family, my extended family, I was fascinated by these relationships that both of my parents had to their brothers. It was such an intense thing. And then, when I was, as I said, the inspiration for this story was at heart the story of the 2 unknown brothers who died in 1971 during this combing raid in their neighborhood. I never knew those brothers. They were, I knew of them, but I never knew them. I never knew the family. I have no personal connection with them at all. But, so I began working with what I knew, with the inspiration, the seed that I had, and I knew that in some way the story would involve 2 brothers, and it's one thing. In the real life version, both brothers are killed, so that's a very intense thing. Needless to say, but then when I started working with the material in terms of telling a story, I sort of intuited that to have one brother involved in the politics and one brother to not be involved and to survive would create a very different kind of story. And I was attracted more to the idea of only one brother being involved and the other brother surviving, partly because at least I can still work with the one surviving brother, right, to tell the story of the brother who dies. Because if you just write about the 2 brothers who die after their death, it just becomes a different story. And then I myself became a mother, and I have 2 children here with me today, and they're a boy and a girl, but they're born very close not that close, but 2.5 years apart. So in a sense, we have raised them side by side, as so many parents do. And so I think from the perspective of a mother, that has also contributed to the creation of these brothers, because I have come to understand what it means to raise 2 children or more. Wouldn't know, but to raise children as a almost as having a common life. And when my mother and father would talk about their relationships to their brothers that they had left behind, it was I think the reason for this intense closeness that they felt was that they were literally raised just like this, all together. And that really kind of, it fascinated me partly because, as I said, I was raised, I was sort of formed as an only child. My sister wasn't born until I was 7.5, so my basic memories of life are of being alone. And so I think all of these things went into the creation of Subhash and Udayan as brothers who are extremely close, but also extremely different. And which is, I think, a very common, I think this idea of two brothers, when I thought about it more, it's a very basic theme, right? A very powerful, basic idea in our, there's sort of almost primordial quality. So much of the mythology of the world, so many religious tales involve two brothers often, right? Very close, and the fate of one versus the fate of the other is a kind of, I live in Rome, there's Romulus and Remus, there's, so many examples of this idea of, two siblings being raised, and so I think that I wasn't consciously thinking of any of this when I wrote the book. I had an interviewer in Italy this year ask me, was I thinking of Castor and Pollux, another pair of, set of two brothers, and I said, no, but, that would have been nice, but I know also in Hindu mythology and all mythologies, I think we have examples of something with two brothers that's very intense. So I think that they are, as you say, they're very different, but intertwined. And so I just started with that idea and tried to build on it. And obviously the political background of the book helped me to distinguish one from the other, and also the fact that one dies quite young and the other survives him. That's a very intense thing, I imagine, to happen to one, to be raised with a brother, basically you're sharing a common day-to-day life, and then to lose that person. I can't really imagine what that's like, not having experienced it, but these are thoughts that I brought into the creating of their characters.
Would you also say that Udayan is also present in his absence, like the movement itself?
Well, I think Udayan, and sorry if this gives away the plot of the book for those who haven't read it, but even if you read the flap of the book, it's sort of obvious that Udayan is the brother who dies, and he loses his life as a very young man, and he is survived by his brother Subhash. And he is, yes, I agree with you. He is very much present in his absence in the book, in the lives of the characters he leaves behind. The book focuses on a very small group of characters. Basically, his brother Subhash, the parents of these two brothers, and the woman Udayan loves and marries and leaves behind. Those are the four people in the book. The four other main characters who know Udayan and who remember him in their individual ways. But I think as with any death, the person lost becomes present in different ways. And so he is a circulating absence in the book and in the lives of all of the characters, and of course each of them remember him in their own ways, and each of them has unresolved issues with him in their own ways.
Thank you. Would you also say that Calcutta is something which you write about, that Calcutta is also a city which is often accessed through nostalgia?
So your question is whether it's accessed through nostalgia by me or by the characters?
Characters, of course.
Well, I mean, I think we sort of hit on this earlier when you asked about the two Calcuttas that exist for the characters, you know. I mean, I think nostalgia is a very interesting thing. I mean, you don't want too much of it, but it is I mean, we can't help but feel nostalgia for certain things in life that we have loved and that we have lost, be it a person or a place or a time of our lives or what have you. I think that, you know, in the lowland, the characters who leave the city have different relationships to it, all very complicated. None of it is easy. I think that when you leave a place, for whatever reason, it does necessarily complicate your relationship to the place that you've left behind. And of course, I know this firsthand because I'm the product of two people who did that. I have always been acutely aware of the degree to which my parents, my mother mostly, but the degree to which Calcutta was an absence in their lives. I mean, this is sort of the fundamental. It's fundamental to my upbringing, is what I'm trying to say. I don't understand the world without being aware of how much the absence of a place can impact and influence and affect and overwhelm a human being. I have constantly been aware of this my entire life. And as a child, I felt very helpless about it, because the fact it was that we didn't live in India, we didn't live anywhere near Calcutta, we lived very far away, and there was nothing I could do for my parents to take this feeling away from them. But I hated the fact that they felt this deep, deep longing for a place that meant so much to them, and that was so drastically absent. So to kind of go back to your question about absence, I think I've also been very aware of absence my whole life, you know, in the same way. I mean, they're all sort of interconnected. Which is probably why I write about these things. But I'm not sure if I'm just repeating the same thing, but I do think that, yes, I mean, nostalgia is something the characters are confronting to greater or lesser degree.
Thanks. Also, Gauri is a fascinating portrayal. How did you come up with a... Is it audible? Yeah? Okay. In the choices that she makes.
I wouldn't like to give away too much of the plot of the book in case anyone would like to read it. You know, I mean, Gauri is a mystery to me, even. I'm not sure where she came from, really. All I can say is I know that the book was not functioning without her. I mean, I was, you know, as I said, I came to the book with these few seeds of the time period, these two brothers, the neighborhood, Taliganj, so on and so forth. So these were like the basic ingredients I started playing with, the idea of the two brothers, so forth. And then, but it really, I was just sort of spinning my wheels for many, many years, not knowing how to take this thing forward, and you know, it just didn't have any kind of engine, so it wasn't going anywhere until Gauri arrived. And once I saw her and began to work her into the lives of these brothers, that was the moment that the book finally started to move forward. And that's, you know, I mean, without that, you don't have a story. So in a sense, I think she is the gravitational center of the book, even though Subhash and Udayan are like the two, you know, the two opposites in a way that revolve around her, but she is essential. She's the key to this book, and she's a character who makes some very very, how should I say, intense decisions, some very disturbing choices, and a character who makes a lot of mistakes, I would say. It was not my interest to judge this character, but it was my interest to get to know her and to understand her and to follow her in her journey as she develops and as time unfolds in the world of the story. As I was writing the book, as I was putting it together and I was sharing it with certain readers to get a kind of, you know, initial reaction, I was aware that this was a very strongly flavored character I was creating. And that she was not your, how shall we say, typical character. Not that there's no such thing as a typical character, right? But she was she's an extreme person in a lot of ways, and she makes some extreme decisions. And as I said, she makes some severe errors. But she's a human being, as we all are, and we all do those things too. No matter who we are, whether we're from the, you know, very meekest, mild sort to the most extreme, outspoken sort, we are all human in that we all fail, and we all make mistakes, we all make grave errors along the line, and we all hurt people whom sometimes the people we're closest to and least want to hurt, we hurt them anyway. And so she's an example of someone who does these things. And so she was a fascinating character for me to work with, because she was full of, because I don't know who she is, I don't know, I mean, there was no model for her. And, you know, sometimes I work, a character comes to me because there's someone I've seen or met kind of briefly or know a little bit, and I take a sort of tiny portion of them and then I start working with that, but they're like the, you know, how do you call it? It's like when you know, there's like the starter, and then the character grows out of something. But in her case, there was really not even the starter, in that there was no person out there in the world that I thought, oh, I can just take a little bit of her and start building. There wasn't even that. So I really feel like she just kind of came out of, I don't know, I mean, my imagination, I realized, but, you know, so I really had to build her from the ground up. And it's very, very exhilarating to do that, I think, from a writer's perspective. It can be, because it's all the unknown. And I really didn't know where this book was going, you know, until it got there. And I didn't know things she had done. I mean, what was interesting is that I only understood certain things about her that she had done in the past once I saw her through time, just in a certain way. So that was all very exciting for me as a writer. But I understand, I mean, now that the book has been published, there seems to be a very strongly divided reaction between people who are interested in her and sympathize with her and feel what she feels. And then there are people who have said to me, simply said to me, I can't believe anyone would ever do any of the things that she does, and, you know, it's just, and I mean, obviously I wouldn't have written her character if I hadn't thought that it is possible for a person to make the series of decisions that she makes, because I always felt sympathy for her. I wouldn't be able to write her character if in some way I didn't feel sympathy for her. But I think, as a writer, you have to have sympathy even for your unsympathetic characters. I don't consider her an entirely unsympathetic character, but I think she's a very complex character with sides of her that are sympathetic and that sides of her that are much more, questionable, shall we say, without getting into the details.
You use memory, of course, as a trope, but there's also this sense that you use secret as a trope, and going back to a book, early story, A Temporary Matter, something which uses the form of the secret. Would you say secret is a continuous trope in understanding relationships?
I'm not conscious of using any tropes when I'm writing, but I think that, as you say, secrets interest me as a writer, and some of my stories have dealt overtly with the theme of secrecy, if you will. Most of the things I've written, there's something that's hidden, that's revealed. But I think this is true of almost everything I've ever read, in that a novel, a short story, is nothing but a portrait, ideally, of a character. And as characters, as people, we all carry so much that we don't express to other people, right? Or sometimes even to ourselves. So I think what makes human beings so fascinating is this double-sidedness that we have in terms of our outward life and our inward life that is interior and that we carry within us. And it's the intersection of those things that interest me as a writer. So in that sense, I think, maybe I keep returning to this idea because I find it so, it's just everywhere. You just wake up and you talk to someone and, every one of you out there has a secret. I just know it, and we all do. We all do. We all have things that we don't feel comfortable admitting, expressing to others, and as I said, and even to ourselves. But this is what creates such an interesting tension, for us as human beings. But certainly from a literary point of view, as a writer, it makes a character so much. I think if you're building a character, even if the story has nothing to do with secrets, you should know that you should know one or two secrets that your character has, just to know your character, because it's such a rich source of knowing. And I think what's interesting for the writer, at least I can say from my perspective, is that because writing is the only way, I think because fiction is the only way I know in which a human being can inhabit the mind of another human being and get inside of those secrets and inhabit them alongside that other person. And that is just a very intense process, creatively speaking. So it continues to be a fascinating place to turn over and to sift through in terms of secrecy but if you look at so much sort of classical literature, at least I can say, if you look at Greek tragedy, so much of it, Shakespeare too, there's the idea of the secret, that is revealed. Even in the comedies of Shakespeare, you have people who are disguised, oh, I'm actually a girl, but so this is like a very basic, a very universal notion, I think, both culturally, anthropologically speaking, but certainly as a literary element.
I think we have about 5 minutes left. I just you write both the novel and the short story, and how do you begin with a narrative? it's going to be a short story collection or a novel?
I usually know very early on whether something will be longer or shorter. You know, with almost everything I've written, it started out as, you know, this is a story versus this is a novel. For example, when I first started thinking about this idea for the lowland, the two brothers, the Naxalite period, so on and so forth, I knew it was going to be a novel. I had never written a novel before, but I had read enough of them to know that there was no way I was ever going to make this a short story. So I think it's just a kind of instinctive, it's an intuitive thing. You know, I think there are some novels that might work better. I mean, some novels I've read that might have been more interesting as a short story. I think I consider myself fortunate because I like working in both forms. And I think that if something can be short, I'd like it to be short. I don't believe this sort of, I don't believe that a novel is important and a short story is incidental. I don't believe that at all. In fact, I actively don't believe that. I think short stories are an incredible form. They're beautiful in their concentration and their economy, and you know, I'm so indebted to so many short story writers. I mean, I think it's a much more pure form than a novel. And in a way, I think a short story is closer to poetry, and it can have such an intense impact that a novel can't. And so I think I would like, you know, to keep it, I would like to keep everything down to the bare minimum. So if something can work as a short story, I would make it a short story. But if I feel like I really can't do it justice, then I begin to think about a different type of treatment of the story. But I really think of my novels as stories too. They're just not short stories. They're just stories rendered in a different way. And maybe I think that because I started out writing short stories, I don't know. But I've never, you know, I go back and forth with all sorts of thoughts and decisions in the writing process in terms of characters and plot and so on and so forth, but I've never set out to write either a short story or a novel and then wondered if it should be the other thing. That's never happened.
I think we have about 5 minutes.
We're going to take 3 questions only, so let's have one from way at the back, one from the middle, and one from the front.
And I'd request you to ask specific and pointed questions, please. Thank you.
So let's take one first from the middle. Let's go here.
Are you asking?
Please stand up and make your question very concise. Don't make a statement. Please make sure you actually have a question.
Can you hear me? Okay. I just wanted to ask you, as an Indian who lives in the West, like a member of the Indian diaspora, with certain Indian values, when you're connected and disconnected to them, how does that sort of reflect in your characters, like for Gopal in The Namesake?
How does that, I'm sorry, I missed the verb. How does
your own journey with connection and disconnection with Indian values reflect in your characters?
How does it reflect in the characters? I imagine it reflects quite a bit in my characters. I mean, all of my characters feel, most of my characters feel a sort of fundamental identity split, as I have. Almost all of my characters have a sense of, have a very conflicted relationship with this idea of belonging, which I have. You know, they don't know where they belong, and they both want to belong and aren't sure if they want to belong. And so, but this is a, I appreciate your question, but the answer is really so vast and very difficult to boil down briefly. But I think one of the reasons that I I write is to try to explore this question from many, many, many different points of view, because for every single person, the fact of being raised in a country that your parents don't necessarily call home or feel is their homeland is something that is common for so many people on the earth, now more than ever. But if you take even 5 of those people and put them in a room, they're each going to have an extremely different experience of that, if you know what I mean. And some will say, oh, I felt totally at home in America, and I don't consider myself, I mean, if you take the example of the Indian diaspora, you know, someone could say, oh, I felt totally American, and I don't speak any Indian languages, and I never went to India, and my parents never took me there, and all I have is an Indian name and whatever. And then you can have someone say the exact opposite, saying, I feel much more Indian than American, and I always went to India, and da-da-da-da. And then you can have, I mean, the range is enormous, because we each are individual and we have our individual experiences. So there's no way to, as I said, there's no way to boil this down, because it is inherently such a complex experience, and the complexity of it must be respected. And I think, part of my project so far as a writer has been simply to meditate on this experience from, and to present a range, because, in my life, in my upbringing, I knew so many people like me, but each of us was completely different as a human being. And each of us had a completely different relationship to who we were, what we thought of our parents, whether or not we liked going to Calcutta. Like, it was just, you could not generalize. It's impossible. And that, of course, is the basic fact of all creative expression, and what I think we as human beings must fight against, this tendency to generalize and to assume things about people, places, cultures, religions, what have you. I mean, I was very aware of that, I mean, I lived in a place where Americans would say, oh, you Indians, you all do this, and then I would come to Calcutta and people would say, oh, in America, they all do that. And I was always, going crazy, saying, but no, they don't all, nobody does you can't say those things, because there's always an exception, and there's so much variety in the world. And so that is, the only way I could answer your question is that there really is no specific way, but yes, in a kind of wide spectrum way, my characters reflect this general experience.
Okay, we have a question at the front here.
Compelling question, please.
I hope this is a compelling question. I wanted to ask you, since Bengal, Calcutta, immigration is such a recurring theme in all your work, maybe your next book, or maybe the work in progress that you have right now, would think about maybe not writing about Bengal, or I'm just wondering, in case you weren't thinking about continuing with this theme.
Well, I don't know what the future holds. At the moment, I'm writing a nonfiction book, and I'm doing something for me that's very different and very challenging. I'm writing a book in another language, which is Italian, because I live in Italy, and I have studied Italian for many, many years, and am a great lover of the language, and felt pretty quickly after moving there the need to start writing in the language, perhaps in a way to better learn the language in some sense. So I'm writing this book in Italian, which is not a fiction book. It's a book about, sort of absurdly, it's a book written in Italian about my relationship to learning Italian. But what I'm discovering in the process of writing the book, which is now turning out to be a sort of I hate to call it a memoir, it's not, but it's sort of a linguistic autobiography, if you will. And as a result of this process of unfolding, investigating what language has meant to me as a person, of course, it's impossible for me to talk about my relationship to Italian without also talking about my relationship to English and without also talking about my relationship to Bengali. And I think I mean, it's going to be a very short book, but it is interesting to think about from a writer's point of view what my language is and what I've already kind of come to understand in the process of writing this book is that I'm a writer without any specific, without a real language that I've ever felt is 100% my own. And maybe, I think there are many other writers like me. I don't think I'm alone in this, but I think it's interesting to be conscious of it for the first time as a writer. Because, you know, I mean, I was born and I spoke Bengali, but I never lived in India. So I was speaking Bengali, I learned Bengali, right? And then at a certain age I went to school and I learned English. And then I started being educated in English, and then I started to read in English. And then I therefore began to write in English. But my relationship to both languages was always very, I mean, I never felt that Bengali was fully mine, and I never really felt that English was fully mine either. So it's just a very interesting, I mean, the book is really sort of a meditation on these things. So it has nothing to do with Calcutta, but it has to do with Bengali. And I think, you know, as a writer, language is the most important thing to me, right? From the writer's point of view. Without language, I'm nobody. But it's interesting to realize, to be conscious. I mean, I always sort of thought of myself as a person who didn't have a particular homeland or particular identity and so on and so forth. That is all true. But what now I'm aware of as an adult, you know, as an older adult, is that in addition to those things that I can't really fully possess or claim, language is a part of that. And I think it's important for me to be aware of that because I think it just deepens my awareness of who I am and where I can go from there. So, I mean, as I said, this book is a kind of experimental project for me, a very challenging one, given that I'm writing now in a language that I learned as an adult and, you know, have a very modest grasp of in the final analysis. I mean, it's one thing to be able to live in a country and speak the language, but to actually write and express yourself in a language that isn't one that, you know, you've grown up with all your life is very intense. So I'm enjoying it for now, and we'll see where that takes me for the next books.
I know many of you will have burning questions, but I'm afraid we do need to wrap up the session. Please join me in thanking Jhumpa Lahiri and Rupleena Bose.
Thank you so much.
This session was presented